The Secrets of the Stones. Part 1. Introduction and Setting. The sun was beginning to set over the quiet countryside. The sky turned a soft orange, casting long shadows on the green fields. In the distance, you could hear birds chirping, getting ready to settle down for the night. It was peaceful, and that peace stretched over the farm where Tom and Ellie lived. Tom was a curious boy, always asking questions about the world around him. His sister Ellie, a little older, was quieter, but she shared his love for adventure. Together, they spent most of their days exploring the fields, woods, and hills that surrounded their small farmhouse. Their parents were busy with the farm work, so Tom and Ellie had plenty of time to explore. One summer evening, they decided to go further than they usually did. They climbed up a steep hill behind their house, a place they hadn't visited before. At the top of the hill, they found something unexpected. There, standing in a rough circle, were large, ancient stones. The stones looked old, very old. They were tall, rough to the touch, and covered with patches of moss. Some were leaning at odd angles, as if they had been there for hundreds of years. Tom walked up to one of the stones and ran his fingers along the surface. "What do you think these are?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Tom's imagination began to run wild. "Do you think they're magic, or maybe they're from another time?" he asked, his mind racing with ideas. Ellie smiled a little. Tom always had a way of turning something ordinary into a grand adventure. Just as the thought crossed his mind, the air around them felt different. A cool breeze swept through the stones, rustling the leaves on the trees nearby. It sent a small shiver down Tom's spine. Ellie noticed it too. There was something unusual about this place, something mysterious. "Maybe we should head back," Ellie said, her voice a little uncertain. But Tom wasn't ready to leave just yet. He felt drawn to the stones, like they were calling him to learn more. He took a step closer to the largest stone in the circle, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's the hurry?" Tom asked, glancing back at his sister. "Let's stay a bit longer. We might discover something amazing." Ellie hesitated, but then she nodded. They decided to stay, feeling the mystery of the stones pulling them in. As the sun dipped lower, casting an eerie light on the stones, Tom and Ellie had no idea how much this place would change their lives. Something about the stones was different, and they were about to uncover its secrets. Part 2. Discovering the Stones. Tom and Ellie stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of the ancient stones around them. There was a certain silence that hung in the air, only broken by the distant rustle of leaves and the soft call of a bird heading home. The stones seemed to watch over them, as though they held stories that had been forgotten for centuries. Tom, always the adventurous one, couldn't resist the urge to explore more. He circled around the largest stone, studying its surface. It was covered with strange, almost faded marking symbols that he didn't understand. "Ellie, come look at this," he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet air. Ellie walked over, her eyes narrowing as she examined the markings. "What do you think they mean?" she asked, tracing her fingers along the symbols. The stone felt cool under her hand, even though the air around them was still warm from the day's sun. "It's like some kind of ancient writing." Tom, now even more intrigued, looked around at the other stones. Maybe these were put here by people long ago. Maybe they were trying to protect something or leave behind a message, he said. He always had a knack for turning the simplest things into a grand mystery. Suddenly, Tom noticed something at the base of one of the smaller stones. A gleam of metal caught his eye. "What's that?" he muttered under his breath, crouching down to get a closer look. Hidden in the grass was a small, old key. It looked rusty, but it was clearly made with care. Tom picked it up, holding it out to Ellie. "Where do you think this came from?" he asked, turning the key over in his hand. It felt heavy, as though it was important, even though it was small. Ellie's eyes widened. "Maybe it's a key to something around here," she suggested. Her mind was now racing with ideas too. "But what? I don't see anything it could unlock." Tom stood up, his heart pounding with excitement. "We need to figure this out," he said. "There's got to be something here. People don't just leave keys lying around." They spent the next few minutes searching the area around the stones. Tom felt a sense of urgency, as if time were running out to discover the secret of the stones. The key seemed to hold some kind of power, but they couldn't figure out what it was for. Ellie started to feel the same sense of mystery, and she wasn't sure if they were ready for whatever they might uncover. As the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear, Tom and Ellie knew they would have to leave soon. But the key, the stones, and the strange symbols stayed in their minds. They had unearthed something important, something that seemed like it would lead to more than just an ordinary adventure. And as they began to head back down the hill, the stones seemed to whisper in the cool night air, as though their secrets were waiting to be revealed. Part 3. The Legend of the Stones. The next morning, Tom and Ellie couldn't stop thinking about the stones and the mysterious key they had found. After breakfast, they decided to go back to the stones and try to learn more. Tom's grandfather, who had lived in the village for many years, might know something about the strange symbols and the history of the stones. When they arrived at their grandfather's cottage, they found him sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool morning air. His wrinkled face lit up as they approached. "What brings you two here so early?" he asked, his voice warm and welcoming. Tom and Ellie eagerly explained their discovery, how they had found the ancient stones and the rusty key hidden in the grass. As they spoke, their grandfather's smile slowly faded, replaced by a look of deep thought. "Ah, the stones," he said quietly, his voice now serious. "There's a story behind those stones, a legend that goes back centuries." Tom and Ellie leaned forward, their eyes wide with curiosity. "Tell us," they urged, eager to hear more. Their grandfather nodded and began to speak, his voice slow and measured. "Many years ago, when our village was still young, the stones were said to be a place of great power. The people who lived here believed that the stones held the spirits of the land, the protectors of the earth. It was said that anyone who could unlock their secrets would gain great knowledge or great danger." Ellie shivered slightly, her mind racing. "What kind of knowledge?" she asked, her voice quiet. Their grandfather leaned in closer. "No one knows for sure," he replied. "But there's an old legend about a boy from the village, long ago, who discovered the key to the stones. They say he found a way to speak to the spirits and was given a great gift. But," he paused, looking at the two of them with a warning in his eyes, "it didn't end well for him. He vanished, and no one ever saw him again." Tom felt a thrill of excitement and fear. "Do you think the key we found is the same one?" he asked, holding it out for his grandfather to see. The key glinted in the sunlight, looking even older and more mysterious than before. Their grandfather looked at the key carefully, his eyes narrowing. "It could be," he said softly. "It looks like the kind of key that might have been used in the old days. But if it is, you need to be careful." The stones are not just old rocks, they have a history. And sometimes, history can be dangerous. Ellie's eyes widened as she imagined what the stones might be hiding. But why were the stones built in the first place? She asked. Her grandfather sighed and sat back in his chair. No one knows exactly, he said. Some say the stones were built to protect the village from something that lived in the hills beyond. Others believe the stones were a gateway to another world, a world of magic and mystery. But the truth has been lost over time. All we have are the stories and the symbols carved into the stones. Tom, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Do you think we could find out more if we went back to the stones? Maybe there's something we missed. Their grandfather hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. It's possible, he said, but you must be careful. The stones hold power, and if you're not careful, that power could turn against you. Promise me you won't take any unnecessary risks. Tom and Ellie promised, though the sense of adventure and mystery still burned inside them. The story of the lost boy, the strange symbols, and the powerful stones only made them more determined to solve the mystery. As they left their grandfather's house, the key felt heavier in Tom's pocket. They knew they were getting closer to something big, but they also knew they had to tread carefully. The legend of the stones was not just a tale, it was a warning. Part 4. Strange Happenings. That evening, as the sun began to set and the shadows grew longer, Tom and Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air felt different, heavier somehow. Even the birds seemed quieter, as if the whole world was holding its breath. After dinner, they decided to take a walk to the edge of the village, toward the hills where the stones stood. As they walked, a soft breeze began to blow, whispering through the trees and stirring the leaves at their feet. Tom glanced at Ellie, who looked just as uneasy as he felt. When they reached the stones, everything seemed normal at first. The stones stood silent and still, their rough surfaces catching the last rays of the setting sun. But as they walked closer, they noticed something strange. The symbols on the stones, which had seemed so worn and faded before, were now glowing faintly. "Do you see that?" Tom whispered, his voice filled with wonder and fear. Ellie nodded, her eyes wide. "They're glowing. But how? What does it mean?" Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out the rusty key. It felt warm in his hand, almost as if it were alive. "Maybe it's connected to the key," he said, holding it up to the stones. As he did, a soft hum filled the air, a sound so low they could barely hear it, but they could feel it in their bones. Suddenly, the wind picked up, swirling around them in a circle, and the hum grew louder. The stones seemed to vibrate, as if something inside them was waking up. The glowing symbols pulsed with light, flickering like flames. Ellie took a step back, her heart pounding. "Tom, maybe we should leave?" she said, her voice shaky. "This doesn't feel right." Tom hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. But before he could decide, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. It wasn't an earthquake, not exactly, but more like a deep, slow rumble from within the earth itself. "Run!" Tom shouted, grabbing Ellie's hand. They sprinted away from the stones, their hearts racing as the wind howled around them. The stones behind them continued to glow and hum, but eventually, as they reached the safety of the village, the strange sounds faded away. Out of breath, they looked back at the hills. The stones had returned to their normal state, but Tom and Ellie knew something had changed. Something had been set in motion, and they were now part of it. Part 5. facing the consequences. The next morning, Tom and Ellie woke up feeling uneasy. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on their minds, and both were too nervous to speak about what had happened. They tried to go about their day as usual, but it was clear that things were far from normal. In the village, there was a sense of tension in the air. People were whispering in hushed voices, and it seemed as though everyone had felt the strange energy from the stones. As Tom walked through the village, he noticed that the sky had taken on a dull gray tone. There was no wind, no sound of birds singing, just an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Ellie found him later that day, her face pale with worry. "Tom, something's wrong," she said quietly. "I heard people talking about the stones. They say something has been disturbed." Tom nodded, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the rusty key once again. "I think it has to do with this. Ever since we found the key and unlocked those symbols, strange things have been happening. We need to tell someone," Ellie said. "Maybe the village elder knows what's going on." Reluctantly, Tom agreed. They made their way to the elder's house, feeling the weight of their actions pressing down on them. The elder was a wise old man, someone who had lived in the village his entire life and knew its secrets better than anyone. When they explained what had happened, the elder's face grew grave. "You have awakened the stones," he said in a low voice. "They hold a power older than the village itself. A curse, some say, while others believe it's a test. Either way, it's dangerous." Ellie's eyes widened in shock. "But we didn't mean to disturb anything. We were just curious." The elder sighed, looking at them with a mixture of pity and concern. "Curiosity often leads to consequences," he said, his voice soft but serious. "Now that the stones have been disturbed, there's no telling what might happen next. The balance has been upset." Tom felt a cold wave of guilt wash over him. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The elder thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "There is a way," he finally said, "but it won't be easy. You'll have to face the power of the stones head on. You must return the key to its rightful place." Ellie's heart pounded. "And what happens if we don't?" The elder didn't answer right away, but his silence spoke volumes. Finally, he said, "If the key isn't returned, the power of the stones will grow stronger, and the village will fall under their influence. Already, you can see the signs: the sky, the silence. It will only get worse." Tom and Ellie exchanged a nervous glance. They hadn't expected their actions to have such serious consequences, but now they had no choice. They would have to make things right. "We'll do it," Tom said firmly. "We'll return the key." The elder nodded slowly. "Be careful. The stones are not easily tamed." With that, Tom and Ellie left, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over them. They had set something into motion, and now they had to fix it before it was too late. Part 6. The Resolution. Tom and Ellie stood once more at the edge of the forest, the key heavy in Tom's pocket. The air was still, and the ominous feeling from before had only grown stronger. As they made their way back to the clearing where the stones stood, it felt as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. The stones were there, looming large and silent, their ancient markings glowing faintly in the dim light. Tom felt a shiver run down his spine. The once beautiful and mysterious stones now seemed threatening, as if they were watching the two intruders approach. "We have to do this," Tom said, trying to sound braver than he felt. Ellie nodded, though her face was pale with fear. Let's finish this. Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out the key. As soon as it was in his hand, the stones began to hum, a low vibrating sound that made the ground tremble beneath their feet. The markings on the stones glowed brighter, pulsing in time with the hum. Where do we put it? Ellie asked, her voice shaky. Tom scanned the stones and noticed a small keyhole at the base of the central stone, just as the elder had described. He moved forward, his hand trembling slightly as he inserted the key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud click, the key fit into place and the humming stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Tom and Ellie stood frozen, waiting for anything to happen. For a few heartbeats, it felt as though time itself had paused. Then, slowly, the glow around the stones began to fade, and the strange tension in the air lifted. Tom let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It's over, he whispered. Ellie nodded, relief flooding her face. The eerie presence that had surrounded the stones had vanished, replaced by a peaceful calm. It was as though the stones had accepted the return of the key, restoring balance to the world around them. We did it, Ellie said, her voice soft but filled with awe. We really did it. They stood there for a moment, taking in the stillness of the forest. The birds began to sing again, and a light breeze rustled through the trees, as if the world had finally woken from a bad dream. Tom smiled at Ellie. Let's go home. As they turned to leave, they both felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. The village, the stones, and the strange events of the past few days already seemed like a distant memory. Something they would talk about years later with wonder and disbelief. But one thing was certain. They would never forget the day they faced the stones and returned the key, bringing peace back to their village.